The knock echoed once, dull and wrong, and then the door cracked open just enough for me to see my son's face. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry either. Just finished. "Go away," Marcellus said. Then his hand moved, slow and deliberate, and I heard the lock turn. Behind him stood his wife Kendra. She didn't step forward. She didn't speak. She just watched me the way someone watches a decision finally being carried out. It was Christmas night in Cleveland, Ohio. Snow packed the edges of the sidewalk. Lights from the neighbors' windows spilled onto the porch where I stood with my coat half-zipped and my purse still on my shoulder. I could hear laughter inside the house next door. Someone's music. Someone else's family. I said his name once. Not loudly. Just enough to remind him who I was. The door didn't open again. I stood there longer than I should have. Long enough for the cold to sink through my shoes. Long enough to notice the wreath I had paid for still hanging crooked on the door I could no longer enter. Long enough to understand that this wasn't a fight. This was a procedure. For months, things had been shifting in small, quiet ways. Mail that stopped coming. Conversations that ended early. Grandchildren suddenly busy. I had told myself it was stress. Holidays. Life. What I didn't know then, but would soon understand, was that while I was paying the property taxes, the insurance, and the medical bills tied to that house, someone else was signing papers. Filing forms. Using an old power of attorney I'd signed back when trust felt permanent. They had already told the neighbors I'd moved out by choice. Already told family I wasn't well. Already decided my place in the story. As I turned away from that locked door, humiliation burned hotter than the cold. But beneath it, something else began to form. Not panic. Not grief. Clarity. Christmas night wasn't the moment I lost my home. It was the moment I stopped protecting my son from what he'd done, and decided I would never beg my way back into a place I was deliberately erased from. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. Before that Christmas night, I believed my life had already settled into its final shape. My name is Laverne Whitbridge, and for most of my adult life, stability meant being useful. After my husband Frederick Whitbridge passed, usefulness became my way of staying anchored. I handled bills. I kept records. I made sure nothing slipped. That was how I loved people, by making sure the ground under them stayed solid. The house in Cleveland wasn't just where my son lived. It was where I had helped rebuild normalcy after loss. I paid the property taxes without being asked. Covered insurance renewals. Took care of medical expenses that still carried Frederick's name because it felt wrong to let them lapse. I never questioned it. Family didn't keep score. When my son Marcellus Whitbridge asked me years earlier to sign a power of attorney, it didn't feel dangerous. He said it was for emergencies. Just in case, he'd told me. I trusted him more than I trusted paperwork. I signed and filed it away, then forgot about it completely. His wife Kendra Whitbridge had come into our lives quietly. Polite. Organized. Always watching, always listening. She talked about efficiency the way other people talked about kindness. I took that as competence, not control. Back then, my days followed a simple rhythm. Morning coffee. Calls with my grandchildren. Small errands tied to the house. The oldest one used to call me every Sunday. The youngest used to run to the door when I arrived. I didn't think of it as dependency, just shared responsibility. Looking back, that was the mistake. I thought presence meant belonging. I thought contribution meant security. I thought love, once earned, couldn't be administratively undone. I didn't know that trust, when written down and left unchecked, could be repurposed. And I had no idea that the ground beneath me was already being quietly measured, divided, and reassigned, long before a door ever closed in my face. By December, the house looked the way it always had during the holidays. Lights along the porch. A plastic reindeer staked into the frozen lawn. The same wreath I'd bought years earlier, fluffed and rehung like tradition itself could be preserved with careful handling. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, things felt thinner. Marcellus still answered my calls, but not right away. Conversations stayed polite and brief, like we were coworkers checking in instead of family. When I stopped by, he was often distracted, phone face down on the counter, attention split somewhere else. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Distance can do the same work. Kendra moved differently. She smiled, but it never reached her eyes. She listened closely, the way people do when they're collecting information. She talked about schedules, budgets, efficiency. Words that sounded harmless until they started replacing warmth. The grandchildren were around less. When I asked why, the answers came quick and rehearsed. Busy. School. Activities. I didn't push. I didn't want to be the problem everyone tiptoed around. Christmas plans were vague. No firm time. No clear invitation. Just we'll see and we'll let you know. I told myself families shifted as children grew older. That I needed to adjust. Still, small things unsettled me. A neighbor I'd known for years asked if I was doing okay living on my own now. Someone else mentioned they hadn't seen my car in a while, even though it was parked where it always had been. I laughed it off. Misunderstandings happened. At night, I replayed conversations, trying to locate the moment I'd missed something important. I told myself I was overthinking. That love didn't evaporate quietly. I didn't know yet that quiet was exactly the point. The power of attorney wasn't something I thought about anymore. I had signed it years earlier, after Frederick's health began to decline. Back then, everything felt fragile. Doctors. Appointments. Forms that came faster than I could read them. Marcellus had offered to help, said it would be easier if he could step in when I couldn't. He framed it as protection, not authority. I remember sitting at the kitchen table when I signed it. Sunlight through the blinds. A pen that didn't work at first. I asked one question, just one. This doesn't give you control unless something happens to me, right? Marcellus had nodded without hesitation. I believed him because I wanted to. After Frederick passed, life didn't fall apart the way people expect. It narrowed. I focused on what was concrete. Bills. The house. Making sure nothing slipped through cracks I couldn't afford. I kept paying property taxes because the notices still came to me. Insurance renewals still had my name on them. Medical bills tied to Frederick's care still needed closing out. No one ever told me to stop. Kendra mentioned paperwork now and then. Always casually. We're just streamlining things. We're organizing records. She never asked me to sign anything else. That made me feel safe. Included. I didn't notice when certain mail stopped arriving. I assumed addresses changed, accounts updated. That was normal. That was progress. What I didn't understand was how easily trust ages into invisibility. How a document signed in good faith could sit quietly, waiting for the moment someone else decided it was time to use it. At the time, I still believed I was standing on solid ground. I didn't realize that the paper I'd forgotten about hadn't forgotten me at all. The first time I realized something was wrong, it didn't come from Marcellus or Kendra. It came from outside. I was loading groceries into my car when a neighbor paused near the sidewalk. Someone I'd waved to for years. He hesitated, then asked if I was settling into the new place okay. I laughed, because I didn't understand the question. I told him I hadn't moved. He looked embarrassed. Apologized. Said he must have mixed things up. But it didn't stop there. Another neighbor asked if I was feeling better lately. Someone else mentioned they heard I was taking a break. The words were soft, careful, like they'd been coached to sound kind. Each comment landed the same way, confusing, unsettling, slightly humiliating. I started paying closer attention. People stopped asking when I'd be home. They stopped assuming I belonged there. Conversations shifted as if my absence had already been accepted. I wasn't being missed. I was being managed. When I brought it up with Marcellus, he brushed it off. Said people misunderstood things all the time. Told me not to worry about gossip. His voice stayed calm, but he didn't ask who said what. He didn't seem curious at all. Kendra smiled and said, "You know how people exaggerate." That word stayed with me. Exaggerate. I wasn't exaggerating anything. I was standing right there. Paying bills. Showing up. Existing. Yet somehow, a version of me had already been circulated. One that lived somewhere else. One that needed space. One that was quietly stepping aside. I went home that night feeling foolish for doubting myself, and even more uneasy for realizing that others seemed to know a story about my life that I had never been invited to hear. The changes with my grandchildren happened so gradually that I almost missed them. At first, it was small things. Calls that went unanswered. Video chats that got postponed. When I asked about weekend visits, Marcellus would say they were tired. Busy. Overscheduled. I told myself that was normal. Kids grow. Lives get full. But then birthdays passed without invitations. I saw photos online, group shots in the living room, smiles framed just right. The oldest was there. The youngest too. Marcellus was there. Kendra was always positioned close, one hand on a shoulder, one arm wrapped just enough to look natural. I wasn't in the pictures. Not even in the background. I told myself I didn't need to be photographed to belong. Still, it hurt. When I asked gently, Kendra's tone shifted into something careful. She said the kids were sensitive lately. That they needed calm. Stability. She said I sometimes got emotional without realizing it. That it confused them. I replayed that word in my head. Emotional. I had cried once that year, at Frederick's grave. I had raised my voice exactly 0 times. I wasn't unpredictable. I was grieving and aging and still showing up. Marcellus didn't contradict her. He nodded. Let her speak for him. That silence felt louder than anything he could have said. After that, access became conditional. Visits required advance notice. Calls were timed. I could feel myself being handled, not included. The worst part wasn't being kept away. It was realizing they were explaining my absence to the children in ways I couldn't correct. Shaping a version of me that sounded fragile. Unsafe. I had spent decades protecting my family from instability. Now, quietly and efficiently, I was being framed as the source of it. The first hard crack in my certainty came in the mail. Or rather, in what didn't arrive. I was sitting at the kitchen table sorting paperwork when I realized I hadn't seen the property tax notice in months. It usually came like clockwork. Thick envelope. My name centered. I told myself maybe the county had changed its system. Gone digital. That happened all the time. Still, something bothered me. I logged into the insurance portal next. The login I'd used for years didn't work. I tried again. Reset the password. Nothing. When I finally reached a representative, she hesitated before answering my questions. Her tone shifted into that careful, neutral register people use when they're not supposed to say much. She told me the policyholder had been updated. Updated to whom, she couldn't say. Not without authorization. I hung up and stared at the wall longer than I meant to. My chest felt tight, not with panic, but with something colder. Calculation. I checked my bank records next. Payments were still going out. Property taxes. Insurance premiums. Automatic, consistent. My money was moving exactly the way it always had. But the confirmations weren't coming back to me. When I asked Marcellus about it, he sighed like I was tiring him. Said systems changed. Said Kendra had taken over some of the paperwork to help. He told me not to stress myself out. That word again. Stress. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I just listened. And for the first time, I understood that my money was still welcome. My presence was not. The tone shifted after that. Not openly. Not all at once. It slipped in under the language of care. Marcellus started checking on me more often, but the questions felt rehearsed. Had I been sleeping well? Was I remembering to eat? Did I feel overwhelmed lately? Each one landed softly, but together they formed a pattern. A quiet audit of my stability. Kendra leaned into it with precision. She spoke slowly, gently, the way professionals do when they're documenting something. She suggested I take breaks. Maybe see someone. She said grief could resurface in unexpected ways. That people my age didn't always notice when stress showed. I recognized the tactic before I named it. They weren't worried about me. They were building a record. Any time I questioned a decision, the conversation tilted. My concern became anxiety. My confusion became forgetfulness. If I pressed, Marcellus would step in and say, "Mom, we're just trying to help." Help felt like being talked over. Like being reduced. I began choosing my words carefully. Short sentences. Neutral tone. No emotion. I didn't want to give them anything they could reinterpret later. Even so, I could feel the shift in how they looked at me. Not like a parent. Not even like an equal. Like a liability that needed managing. The worst part was how effective it was. I started second-guessing myself. Wondering if I really was missing things. If the unease I felt was grief, not instinct. That doubt did more damage than any argument could have. By the time Christmas week arrived, the groundwork had already been laid. Whatever came next wouldn't sound cruel. It would sound responsible. I hadn't planned to stay long. I brought a small bag of gifts. Nothing loud. Nothing excessive. Just sweaters for the kids, a book I thought Marcellus would like, cookies I'd baked that morning because habits are hard to break. I told myself I'd drop everything off, say hello, and leave before anyone felt uncomfortable. The house was lit up when I arrived. Warm light spilling through the windows. I could see movement inside. Shadows crossing walls I knew by heart. I knocked. The door opened partway. Marcellus stood there, blocking the frame. He didn't invite me in. He didn't step aside. He looked past me once, like he was checking something behind me, then back at my face. "We talked about this," he said. I didn't remember any conversation that sounded like that. Before I could respond, his hand moved. The door closed halfway. Then all the way. I heard the lock click into place, sharp and final. "Go away," he said through the door. I stood there, staring at the wood grain where his face had been seconds earlier. Behind the glass, I caught a glimpse of Kendra. She was standing just back from the entryway, arms folded loosely, expression calm. She didn't look shocked. She looked relieved. I felt heat rush to my face. Not anger yet. Just disbelief. I knocked again. Softly. Once. I said his name. Not loudly. Not desperately. Nothing. Inside, I heard movement continue. Music. Dishes. Life going on. I stepped back onto the porch, clutching the bag of gifts like proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. Christmas lights blinked around me. Somewhere down the street, someone laughed. And I realized I had just been locked out of more than a house. I didn't rush away. At first, my body wouldn't let me. I stood there on the porch, bag of gifts hanging from my hand, staring at the door as if it might correct itself. As if this was a mistake that would rewind if I stayed still long enough. It didn't. The cold crept in slowly. Through the soles of my shoes. Along my fingers. I tucked my hands into my coat and stepped off the porch, careful not to slip on the thin layer of ice near the steps. That's when I noticed the curtains across the street shift. A neighbor's face appeared briefly, then vanished. Someone else's porch light clicked on. I wasn't invisible. I was being witnessed. Humiliation settled in my chest, heavy and quiet. Not the dramatic kind. The kind that sinks in and stays. I imagined what they'd been told. That I'd moved out. That I was unstable. That this was for the best. I walked to my car slowly, every step deliberate. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't give anyone the scene they might later describe as proof. As I opened the trunk, the bag ripped slightly at the seam. One of the sweaters slipped out and fell onto the snow. I picked it up, brushed it off, and placed it back inside like the action still mattered. Before getting in the car, I looked back once more at the house. Lights glowing. Wreath still crooked on the door. My car was the only one pulling away. That's when the truth settled in fully. This hadn't been a moment of anger. It had been a decision already shared with others. And I was leaving exactly the way they had planned, quietly, politely, and in full view of everyone who would later be told I chose to go. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was replaying the words. There hadn't been many. What stayed with me was the order of things. The timing. The calm way it had all unfolded, like a checklist being completed. By morning, the shock had worn off enough to leave something clearer behind. This hadn't been an argument that got out of hand. No voices raised. No threats exchanged. The door had closed because it was supposed to. Because the paperwork was already done. Because the story had already been told to everyone else. I sat at a small table in the room where I'd spent the night and laid out the facts the way I would a budget. I had been paying for a house I was no longer welcome in. My access to information had been quietly cut off. My reputation had been softened, shaped, and shared without my consent. That wasn't neglect. It was administration. And administration leaves records. For the first time since Frederick died, I felt something close to steadiness. Not comfort. Not peace. Direction. I stopped asking myself what I'd done wrong. I stopped wondering how to fix it. Those questions belonged to a version of me they'd already replaced. What mattered now was understanding exactly what had been done in my name, and how far it had gone. I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence at the top of the page. Do not confront. Document. Whatever came next wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be emotional. But it would be exact. And for the first time since that door locked, I knew I wasn't finished. I was just done protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. I didn't call anyone the next day. That surprised me. I'd always been the type to explain, to smooth things over before silence could harden into something permanent. This time, I let the quiet sit. It felt unfamiliar, but not unbearable. I stayed where I was for a few days. A small room, borrowed space. Outside the window, Cleveland kept moving, gray lake wind, salt on the roads, and Christmas lights still blinking like nothing had happened. I kept my coat folded on the chair like I might need to leave at any moment. Old habits die slowly. But something in me had already shifted. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I started with what I could control. I made a list. Accounts I paid. Bills I handled. Services tied to the house. I didn't assume anything yet. I just wrote. Dates. Amounts. Automatic drafts. Patterns. When I tried to log into the county property portal, I hit a wall. The system showed the address, but my access was gone. I double-checked the spelling. Reset the password. Same result. I called the county office and waited on hold long enough for the recorded voice to loop twice. When a clerk finally answered, she confirmed the property record had been updated months earlier. She couldn't say more without the current owner's authorization. That word again. Authorization. I thanked her and hung up. No confrontation. No reaction. Next, I called the bank. Not to accuse. Just to ask what documentation was required to review transactions tied to an account I'd historically paid into. The answer came with caveats. Waiting periods. Forms. Verification steps. Friction. By evening, I understood two things clearly. First, this wasn't going to move fast. Second, that worked in my favor. They thought the story was finished. I was just beginning to read the footnotes. By the end of the week, I had learned the sound of polite refusal. Every office spoke the same language, just dressed differently. Privacy. Authorization. Process. No one accused me of anything. No one helped me either. At the county recorder's office, a woman explained that any deed changes would require a formal request. In writing. With identification. Processing time could take weeks. She said it kindly, like she was offering comfort instead of delay. At the insurance company, I was transferred 3 times before someone finally told me the policy was no longer under my name. When I asked when that changed, the answer came slowly. Carefully. Earlier this year. Earlier this year. Not recently. Not accidentally. I wrote it down. I scheduled a meeting with an attorney next. Not a dramatic one. Just someone recommended for estate and property matters. The appointment was 2 weeks out. That felt intentional too. Time wasn't my ally yet. In the meantime, I requested copies of everything I was legally allowed to see. Statements. Correspondence. Notices. Each request came with disclaimers and waiting periods. Each one felt like pushing against glass. The hardest part wasn't the delays. It was how calm everyone assumed I should be. As if whatever had happened was already settled. As if my role now was acceptance, not inquiry. At night, I reviewed what little I had. Dates that clustered. Changes that happened without explanation. Names that appeared where mine used to be. I resisted the urge to confront Marcellus. To demand answers. That was the response they expected. Emotional. Unfocused. Easy to dismiss. Instead, I let the process slow me down. Every form I filled out felt like a small refusal to disappear. They had moved quickly, quietly, and with confidence. I was moving differently. Deliberately. The attorney's office was smaller than I expected. No grand lobby. No sense of urgency. Just a quiet room, shelves of binders, and a man who listened more than he spoke. I explained the situation without drama. The power of attorney. The house. The lock on the door. I stuck to facts. Dates. Documents. What I knew and what I didn't. He asked to see the power of attorney. I hadn't looked at it in years. When I finally unfolded the copy I'd kept, the language felt heavier than I remembered. Broad. Flexible. Not as protective as I'd believed. But not unlimited. The attorney pointed out what mattered. The power of attorney allowed certain actions, but not all of them. Not without clear triggers. Not without proper accounting. And certainly not without documentation that I was incapacitated. That word sat between us for a moment. Incapacitated. I had never been declared unfit. No doctor. No court. No record of concern beyond what someone might casually claim. He explained how these situations usually played out. Slow reviews. Requests for justification. Burdens of proof that shifted once questions were formally raised. He didn't promise outcomes. He didn't need to. He told me one more thing before I left. Don't warn them, he said. If there's misuse, silence gives us cleaner lines. That confirmed what my instincts had already decided. On the way out, I sat in my car and let myself feel it, just briefly. The anger. The grief. The betrayal layered under betrayal. Then I set it aside. This wasn't about confronting my son. It was about understanding exactly how far he and his wife had gone, and making sure they couldn't quietly walk away from it. Once I knew what to look for, the inconsistencies became harder to ignore. I laid everything out on the table, printouts, notes, timelines written in neat columns. Dates from the county. Insurance changes. Bank withdrawals that still came from my account but no longer returned information to me. Each piece alone could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that didn't breathe right. One date kept pulling my attention back. The deed transfer, according to the county clerk, had been filed in late spring. Around the same time, Kendra had suggested I take things easier and let them handle more details. Around the same time, Marcellus had asked, casually, whether I still had copies of certain records. I'd thought nothing of it then. Now I circled the date in red. Another inconsistency followed. A notarization stamp on one document didn't match the notary's listed commission period. It was a small thing. The kind most people would never notice. But it mattered. I called the notary's office and left a message. Not an accusation. Just a request to confirm dates. The return call came hours later. The answer was careful, but it didn't align with what had been filed. I wrote that down too. What unsettled me most was how confident they must have felt. Confident enough to rush. Confident enough to assume no one would check. They hadn't relied on force. They'd relied on fatigue. On grief. On the assumption that I would be too embarrassed, too tired, or too unsure of myself to ask questions. I folded the papers back into their folder and closed it gently. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about proving that the story they told about me, about necessity, about good intentions, didn't hold up under light. And once light enters, it rarely stops at the edges. There was one account I hadn't mentioned to anyone. Not to Marcellus. Not to Kendra. Not even during my first meeting with the attorney. Frederick had been cautious in ways I only understood after he was gone. Years earlier, he'd moved a portion of his investments into a separate account, nothing flashy, just steady, long-term growth. He told me about it one evening without ceremony, like he was reminding me where the breaker box was. If anything ever feels off, he'd said, this one stays with you. The account required in-person verification for major changes. Biometric authorization. Not because we expected betrayal, but because Frederick distrusted convenience disguised as security. After Christmas, I went to the bank branch where the account was held. I didn't rush. I scheduled an appointment. Brought identification. Let the process unfold at its own pace. The banker confirmed what I already suspected. No changes had been made. No access attempts flagged. No secondary authorizations added. My name was the only one on record. I didn't smile. I didn't feel relief exactly. What I felt was balance returning. A weight shifting. The house had been treated like the prize. The visible thing. The symbol of control. They had moved quickly there, confident I wouldn't question it until it was too late. They never asked about the rest. I left the bank with nothing in my hands but copies of confirmation pages and a quiet understanding. This wasn't a scramble anymore. It was leverage. And for the first time since that door closed, I knew I could afford to let the process take as long as it needed. They had taken what they thought mattered. I still held what made their certainty fragile. That night, I sat with the temptation to move faster. Now that I knew what they hadn't touched, it would have been easy to act. To demand. To threaten. To let Marcellus know that whatever he thought he'd secured was incomplete. I didn't. Instead, I asked myself what rushing would give me. Satisfaction, maybe. A brief sense of power. And then what? A scramble on their end. Documents rewritten. Stories adjusted. Damage contained. Speed would help them more than it helped me. So I slowed everything down. I organized my notes into clean folders. Labeled timelines. Cross-checked dates against statements. I highlighted patterns, not conclusions. The kind of preparation that doesn't announce itself. I followed the attorney's guidance exactly. No contact. No reaction. No hints that I knew more than I'd already revealed. Silence became my boundary. The fear crept in around midnight. The old fear, the one that said I was being too cautious, too polite, too late. That if I didn't act now, I'd lose whatever leverage I thought I had. I let that fear speak. Then I set it aside. Because this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about control. And control didn't come from being louder or faster. It came from choosing the pace. They were living as if the matter was closed. As if the narrative had settled. As if I was somewhere quietly accepting what had happened. I let them believe that. Every day I didn't call. Every question I didn't ask. Every explanation I refused to give, those were choices. By the end of the week, I wasn't waiting anymore. I was preparing. And preparation, I learned, feels a lot like patience, until the moment it stops being gentle. Words started to reach me without my asking. A cousin mentioned, casually, that Marcellus had said I needed space. Someone else said they heard I was resting and didn't want visitors. The language was soft, sympathetic. Designed to sound considerate. I didn't correct them. That was a choice too. I let the story sit as it was told, unchanged by my voice. Not because it was true, but because correcting it would have required me to explain. And explanation would have tipped my hand. Instead, I listened. Every version of the story carried small differences. Dates that shifted. Reasons that softened. Justifications that grew more elaborate over time. Those variations mattered. They showed improvisation. Strain. One afternoon, a neighbor I trusted asked if I was doing better now. I asked what they meant. Gently. Curious, not defensive. They hesitated, then said Marcellus and Kendra had told people I was overwhelmed and needed distance for my own good. For my own good. I thanked them for checking on me and changed the subject. That night, I wrote down every phrase I'd heard repeated. The exact wording. Who said it? When? Not because I planned to confront anyone with it, but because stories told too often begin to contradict themselves. The most damaging lies aren't dramatic. They're the ones that sound reasonable. By staying silent, I wasn't agreeing with them. I was letting them expand. And expansion, when unsupported by facts, creates gaps. Gaps that paperwork, timelines, and records are very good at exposing. They thought my silence meant I was ashamed. It didn't. It meant I was letting them talk themselves into corners I wouldn't have to push them into later. The first push came quietly. A letter arrived from an attorney I didn't recognize. Polite. Formal. It referenced the property, the power of attorney, and suggested that any unauthorized interference could complicate matters unnecessarily. The tone was measured, almost friendly. A warning wrapped in reassurance. I read it twice. They thought I was hovering. Guessing. Reaching without understanding the edges. The letter wasn't meant to scare me into action, it was meant to scare me into stopping. I didn't respond. A few days later, Marcellus called. The first time since Christmas. His voice was careful, controlled. He said he was worried about me. Said things had gotten complicated and that lawyers made everything harder than it needed to be. I told him I was fine. Nothing more. The silence on the other end stretched longer than he expected. He filled it by talking. Explaining. Justifying. Saying they were only doing what was practical. What anyone would do. I listened without correcting him. Without agreeing. After we hung up, I noticed what mattered most. They were reacting. Up until then, they had acted as if the situation was complete. Closed. Now they were testing boundaries. Applying pressure. Trying to reassert control before something solid formed against them. That shift told me everything. I forwarded the letter to my attorney and added one note: timeline escalation begins here. The fear I'd been managing changed shape that night. It didn't disappear, but it sharpened into focus. They had moved from confidence to concern. And concern, when it arrives uninvited, is usually the first sign that certainty is cracking. After that call, I changed nothing on the surface. No new requests. No replies. No visible shift in routine. If they were watching for a reaction, I didn't give them one. Behind the scenes, I became more precise. I stopped speaking in generalities and started working in sequences. What happened first? What followed? What overlapped? I laid my notes out chronologically and marked where decisions had been made without my knowledge. The gaps stood out more clearly that way. My attorney confirmed what I already sensed. The letter I'd received wasn't a threat, it was a probe. An attempt to establish boundaries before I could. That meant time still mattered. I requested certified copies of the deed filings. Not rush delivery. Standard processing. I asked for transaction histories tied to the insurance changes. Again, through official channels only. Each request triggered another waiting period. Another pause. Another opportunity for them to guess without knowing. In the meantime, I practiced restraint. When Marcellus texted asking if we could talk things through, I didn't reply. When Kendra emailed about retrieving items I'd left behind, I forwarded it to my attorney without comment. Silence wasn't passive anymore. It was directional. I could feel the shift in how they approached me. Messages became shorter. Less confident. They started checking in instead of informing. That told me I was doing something right. People who feel secure don't fish for reassurance. By saying less, I let their uncertainty grow. And uncertainty, I was learning, is heavier than confrontation. The next delay didn't come from an office or a form. It came from a person. The notary I'd contacted earlier finally agreed to speak with my attorney. Not in writing. Not officially. Just a call. Even that took days to schedule. When it happened, the answers came carefully, wrapped in pauses and qualifications. The notary didn't deny the signature. But they hesitated when asked about the date. They said memory faded. Records had to be checked. That they didn't want to be pulled into a family dispute. Their voice carried the weight of someone realizing too late that neutrality had already been compromised. I understood the fear. Being involved meant responsibility. And responsibility was exactly what everyone else had been avoiding. My attorney didn't push. He thanked them and ended the call politely. When he called me afterward, he explained what the hesitation meant. It's not clean, he said. If it were, they'd be confident. That was enough. I felt a flicker of frustration then. Not anger, impatience. I wanted something solid. Something undeniable. Instead, I had fragments. Doubt. People edging away from certainty. But fragments add up. Later that week, another neighbor reached out. Someone who had overheard conversations. Someone who'd been told I'd agreed to leave for a while. They weren't sure when. Or how. Just that it had been presented as settled. I didn't ask them to write anything down. I didn't need statements yet. I just listened. What I was collecting now wasn't proof for court. It was confirmation that the story had been rehearsed, and that the people repeating it were no longer confident in their roles. Hesitation spreads. Once it does, silence stops looking like guilt. It starts looking like restraint. The first certified packet arrived on a Tuesday. Thick envelope. Official seal. No drama, just wait. I sat at the table and opened it slowly, the way you do when you already know what you're about to find, but need to see how cleanly it's written. The deed transfer was there in black and white. Filed in late spring. Executed under the power of attorney. Signed in my name. But the supporting documentation was thin. No medical determination. No affidavit of incapacity. No record explaining why such authority had been exercised at all. Absence can be louder than presence. The insurance changes followed the same pattern. Ownership updated. Contact information replaced. My financial responsibility preserved, my visibility removed. I spread the pages out and compared dates. The day the deed was filed. The week the insurance changed. The same period Kendra had suggested I rest more. The same stretch when neighbors started treating my absence as a fact. This wasn't sloppy. But it was rushed. People who believe they won don't slow down to double-check. I scanned copies and sent them to my attorney. He called later that afternoon, his tone measured but firm. This crosses from questionable into defensible, he said. Especially if the timeline holds. That word, defensible, settled something in me. Not relief. Readiness. Because now the truth didn't depend on anyone's memory or courage. It existed on paper. I stacked the documents neatly, placed them back in the envelope, and set it aside. Not to confront. Not yet. Just to know. They had built their certainty on the idea that I wouldn't look. They were wrong. And for the first time, the story they'd written about me began to contradict itself, using their own ink. The message came that evening. Not legal. Not formal. Just a text from Marcellus, written like nothing serious had ever happened. Maybe we can reset. Sit down. Clear the air. There it was. The olive branch. Extended only after pressure appeared. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. I could almost hear his voice, careful and tired. I knew the move. If I agreed, the tone would soften. Regret would be implied, not spoken. The focus would shift to feelings instead of facts. It was tempting. Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted acknowledgement. Some sign that what they'd done mattered. That it hurt. But acknowledgement without consequence is just another way to regain control. I didn't respond. An hour later, another message arrived. This one from Kendra. Shorter. More precise. She suggested mediation. Said misunderstandings happened. Said it might be healthier for everyone. Healthier. I forwarded both messages to my attorney and set my phone face down. That night, the doubt came back, sharp and familiar. The question of whether I was being too cold. Too rigid. Whether refusing to engage made me look unreasonable. Then I remembered the door closing. The lock turning. The calm on Kendra's face. They hadn't asked for a conversation then. They had acted. So I stayed silent. Refusing to meet wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. And clarity, I was learning, doesn't argue. It simply stops participating in conversations designed to erase what already happened. The shift didn't announce itself with a phone call or a warning. It showed up as process. My attorney filed a formal request for accounting tied to the power of attorney. Not an accusation. Just a demand for records. Dates. Justifications. Receipts. The kind of request that forces someone to slow down and explain themselves in writing. A few days later, another letter arrived. This one addressed to Kendra. From her professional licensing board. Routine language. Neutral tone. A notice of inquiry. My attorney had sent a narrow packet, just enough to request clarification, and that was enough to start the review that led to it. Unrelated on paper. Connected in timing. I didn't need to celebrate it. I understood what it meant. Systems don't act on emotion. They act on patterns. Once a pattern is flagged, it doesn't care who you are or why you thought you were justified. Marcellus called again. This time his voice lacked polish. He asked what I was trying to do. Said things were spiraling. Said mistakes happened, and that involving outside people was unnecessary. I told him I wasn't doing anything. Which was true. I wasn't pushing. I wasn't threatening. I wasn't negotiating. I was letting institutions do what they were designed to do when paperwork stops making sense. The difference mattered. That night, I reviewed my notes one last time and realized something important. I hadn't escalated. I had stopped absorbing the consequences for choices I didn't make. The pressure they felt wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the gap between what they'd done and what they could justify. And that gap, once opened, doesn't close quietly. The confidence I'd grown used to hearing from them was gone. Marcellus stopped leaving long messages. When he did reach out, it was clipped. Reactive. He asked questions instead of making statements. Wanted to know what I'd filed. Who I'd spoken to. How far things had gone. I didn't answer. Kendra's silence was louder. For weeks, she had been the one managing communication, smoothing edges, choosing words carefully. Now there was nothing. No emails. No texts. No attempts to reframe. That absence told me more than any explanation could have. My attorney called to let me know the accounting request had been acknowledged. Deadlines were now in place. Extensions could be requested, but only with justification. Silence wasn't an option anymore. He also mentioned, carefully, that inquiries from the licensing board had expanded. Not accusations. Reviews. Requests for clarification. Process again. That night, I sat with the realization that the power dynamic had shifted without a single confrontation. No raised voices. No ultimatums. Just systems doing what individuals couldn't argue their way out of. For the first time since Christmas, I felt something close to relief. Not because I was winning, but because I no longer felt hunted. They had tried to manage me quietly. Now they were being managed. I didn't feel satisfaction in that. Just steadiness. Whatever happened next wouldn't depend on persuasion or emotion. It would depend on records. And records don't respond to calm smiles or practiced concern. Marcellus showed up where I was staying without asking first. He looked tired. Not angry. Not defensive. Just worn down in a way I hadn't seen before. The certainty he used to carry so easily wasn't there anymore. He said he just wanted to explain. I let him talk. He told me they were trying to protect the house. That bills had piled up. That decisions had to be made quickly. He said Kendra understood paperwork better than either of us, and that he'd trusted her to handle it the right way. Every sentence leaned on the same idea. Someone had to decide. What he never said was that I'd agreed. He never claimed I'd been consulted. He didn't say I was incapable, only that things had been hard and that he didn't want to burden me. That distinction mattered. When I asked him one question, just one, he stopped. Why didn't you tell me after it was done? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice dropped. He said he knew I wouldn't like it. There it was. Not confusion. Not necessity. Choice. I told him I wasn't discussing it. That anything further should go through attorneys. My voice stayed even. Calm. Final. He looked at me then, really looked, like he was seeing a version of me he hadn't expected. Someone not asking to be let back in. Someone not pleading to be understood. As he left, I realized something else had shifted. He wasn't trying to convince me anymore. He was trying to convince himself. After Marcellus left, I didn't feel shaken. I felt finished. Not with the situation that was still unfolding, but with the part of myself that waited for him to choose differently. That part had been quiet for weeks. Now it was gone. My attorney called the next morning to confirm what I already sensed. The accounting deadline had passed without a complete response. Extensions had been requested. Reasons offered. None of them addressed the missing justifications. That mattered. Once deadlines start slipping, narratives collapse faster than people expect. I asked one question. Not about strategy. Not about timing. Do I need to do anything else? He said no. Everything that needed to move was already moving. That afternoon, I boxed up the few remaining personal items I still had access to. Not because I needed them, but because I didn't want any excuse to return. No loose ends. No practical reasons for contact. I changed my mailing address. updated my records, redirected what little still came to me from that house. Each step felt like closing a door gently instead of slamming it. By evening, the emotional weight I'd been carrying since Christmas lifted just enough for me to recognize it. This wasn't escalation anymore. It was separation. They would continue to explain themselves, to boards, to attorneys, to each other. I wouldn't be part of that conversation. The line had been drawn without ceremony. And from this point forward, whatever consequences arrived would do so without my voice, my presence, or my permission. I had stepped out of the story they were trying to control. That was the moment it became irreversible. The first consequence arrived without ceremony. No call. No warning. Just a copy of a filing my attorney forwarded to me with a short note attached: "This is moving." The licensing board had escalated its inquiry. What began as a routine request for clarification had turned into a formal review. Deadlines were no longer flexible. Explanations were now required under penalty of further action. I read the notice once and set it down. I didn't feel satisfaction. What I felt was distance. Like watching a storm move across land I no longer lived on. Later that week, a second update came in. The accounting for the power of attorney was deemed incomplete. Requests for extensions were denied. Additional documentation was ordered. Failure to comply would trigger sanctions and potential civil exposure. Still, I did nothing. No response. No commentary. No reaction that could be misinterpreted as intent. Marcellus tried to reach me again. Not with explanations this time. With urgency. He left a voicemail asking if I knew what was happening, if I could help clarify things, if we could at least talk. I deleted it without listening twice. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Control had moved away from them and into systems that didn't care about tone or family history. Institutions don't soften because someone is frightened. They don't pause because a choice now feels heavy. They simply proceed. That night, I sat quietly and realized something important. The reckoning they feared didn't require my presence. In fact, my absence made it sharper. I wasn't there to absorb blame. I wasn't there to negotiate meaning. I wasn't there to make it easier. For the first time, consequences were landing exactly where they belonged, without me standing in the way. I heard about the rest secondhand. A neighbor mentioned it first, cautiously, like they weren't sure how much I already knew. Then a cousin called, lowering their voice even though we weren't in the same room. The story they'd been told was unraveling, and people were starting to notice the seams. The house was no longer spoken about with certainty. Ownership was described as complicated. Someone said a certified letter came back to the house stamped "Return to Sender." Another person swore they saw a man in a plain jacket take photos of the front door and leave. The confidence that once framed every explanation had thinned into qualifiers and pauses. Someone asked why I hadn't been consulted if everything had been above board. Someone else wondered aloud why professionals were involved at all if it was just a family matter. Questions replaced assumptions. The licensing review didn't stay private for long. Word travels fast when people stop agreeing on what's true. The calm image Kendra had maintained began to fracture, not through accusation, but through absence. She stopped attending events. Stopped answering questions. Stopped showing up where she'd once been visible. Marcellus, I was told, looked smaller. Quieter. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he repeated the same justifications I'd already heard, but now they sounded thin, unsupported. What struck me wasn't the public shift. It was how little I needed to say. The narrative didn't break because I challenged it. It broke because it couldn't stand on its own anymore. When stories rely on one person staying silent forever, they fail the moment silence stops serving them. I hadn't exposed anyone. I had simply stepped away and let the truth run out of places to hide. And in that space, where certainty used to live, people began seeing what had been missing all along. The messages changed tone after that. No more explanations. No more reassurances framed as concern. What came instead were fragments, unfinished thoughts, questions sent and unsent, calls that rang once and stopped. Marcellus left a voicemail late one evening. He didn't ask for help. He asked if I was angry. I didn't respond. Anger would have implied engagement. I wasn't there anymore. What reached me through others was clearer. Meetings that ended without resolution. Requests that came back with more conditions attached. People who had once nodded along now asking for documentation. Proof. Justification. The ground beneath them was no longer stable. Kendra's professional circle began to shrink. Not through confrontation, but through distance. Invitations slowed. Conversations shortened. People don't like standing near uncertainty when it starts drawing attention. She didn't defend herself publicly. That would have required explaining details she couldn't fully support. Silence, which once worked in her favor, now worked against her. Marcellus tried once more to reframe things, to suggest that everything had gotten out of hand. That it wasn't meant to go this far. But consequences don't measure intent. They measure action. What struck me most was how small it all became. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just a steady narrowing of options. The collapse wasn't loud. It was procedural. And in that quiet narrowing, I understood the difference between revenge and accountability. The collapse wasn't loud. It was procedural. And once the process starts, it doesn't ask permission to keep going. The last threads loosened without a conversation. My attorney confirmed that my name had been fully disentangled from any financial responsibility tied to the house. No more automatic payments. No more lingering obligations quietly draining into something I no longer touched. The accounts were clean. So were the boundaries. I changed the final access points myself. Passwords. Authorizations. Contact permissions. I also locked the investment account behind instructions that required me, no proxies, no efficiency, no shortcuts. Anything that still linked my name to theirs was removed carefully, one step at a time. Not in anger. In order. There was no announcement. They found out when things stopped working. A payment failed. A request stalled. A form came back unanswered. Systems don't explain why access disappears. They just reflect reality. Marcellus sent a message asking if I'd changed something. Short. Uncertain. I didn't reply. Kendra didn't reach out at all. That silence confirmed what I already knew. She understood systems well enough to recognize when a door had closed without ceremony, and why it wouldn't reopen. For the first time since Christmas, I wasn't reacting to what they did next. I was deciding what I would never allow again. Removing access wasn't revenge. It was self-respect made visible. I wasn't cutting ties to hurt them. I was cutting ties so nothing else could reach me without consent. The difference mattered. Because when access is gone, manipulation loses its footing. And without footing, even the most carefully constructed control collapses under its own weight, quietly, and without my involvement. There was a moment, late one afternoon, when I almost reached out. Not because I needed anything. Not because I felt unsure. It was muscle memory. The reflex to check in. To soften what felt hard. To make sure everyone was coping. That instinct had guided most of my adult life. I sat with it instead of acting on it. I thought about what reaching out would actually do. It wouldn't clarify anything. It wouldn't repair what had already been decided without me. It would only reopen a channel they could use to reframe, explain, or quietly pull me back into managing their discomfort. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. The urge passed slowly. Like a tide pulling back after years of pushing forward. That evening, I received a message from Marcellus. Not a request. Not an explanation. Just a sentence, "I don't understand why you won't talk to me." I read it once. Understanding wasn't the problem. I knew exactly why I wasn't talking. I also knew that explaining it again would serve no purpose. He had understood enough to act in secret. Enough to lock a door. Enough to let others believe I had chosen to disappear. I didn't owe him another explanation now that consequences had arrived. Silence wasn't punishment. It was alignment. For the first time, my actions matched what I knew to be true. That access to me was no longer automatic. That my role wasn't to absorb confusion or soften outcomes. The reflex to reach out faded completely. In its place was something steadier. Resolve, not loud, not performative, just final. The final message came weeks later. Not from Marcellus. From Kendra. It was carefully worded. Neutral. Almost professional. She acknowledged that mistakes were made and suggested that time had a way of putting things into perspective. She didn't apologize. She didn't deny anything either. She asked if we could meet. I read the message twice, not because it was confusing, but because it was familiar. This was how she handled conflict, by repositioning herself as reasonable, composed, open to dialogue once the ground had already shifted. A meeting would have given her something she no longer had. Context. It would have allowed her to steer the tone. To frame outcomes as misunderstandings. To soften edges that didn't need softening anymore. I didn't respond. That was my answer. Later, my attorney informed me that the licensing board had issued formal findings. Not all of them public yet. Enough to limit her standing. Enough to ensure future scrutiny. The timing wasn't lost on me. She reached out when she realized control was gone, not before. That mattered. Rejection didn't require words. It required consistency. I didn't block her number. I didn't send a boundary speech. I didn't explain my silence. I simply didn't move. Psychological dominance isn't about winning the last exchange. It's about refusing to participate in one that no longer belongs to you. And in that stillness, I felt something close to peace, not relief, not triumph. Just the quiet certainty that there was nothing left to say. What surprised me most was how quiet everything became afterward. No more messages. No indirect questions passed through relatives. No updates that carried urgency. The situation that once felt consuming receded into something distant, like a storm that had moved on without warning. People adjusted faster than I expected. Family members stopped asking when I'd be back. Neighbors stopped lowering their voices around me. The story settled into something simpler and truer, without anyone needing me to correct it. Absence had done the work explanation never could. I began noticing what filled the space instead. Mornings without tension. Evenings without waiting for a phone to light up. Decisions made without factoring in how they would land with anyone else. My life narrowed in the best way, down to what I could touch, manage, and choose. The house came up less and less in conversation. So did Marcellus and Kendra. Not because they were forgotten, but because they were no longer central. Consequences have a way of shrinking people back to their appropriate size. One afternoon, I caught myself laughing at something small. The sound startled me. It had been a while since laughter came without qualification. I realized then that peace doesn't arrive as a reward. It arrives when you stop standing in the way of it. There was no closure conversation. No final reckoning scene where everything was said out loud. The truth had already settled into the places where it mattered. I didn't need an ending that looked dramatic. I needed one that felt honest. And honesty, I learned, is often very quiet once you stop explaining yourself to people who chose not to listen. Winning didn't erase everything. That was the part no one talked about. There were moments, unexpected, ordinary ones, when the absence hit harder than the betrayal ever had. A holiday commercial. A child's laugh in a grocery store aisle. The instinct to reach for my phone and share something small, only to remember there was no safe place left to send it. I had protected myself, but protection comes with distance. I thought about my grandchildren often. The oldest. The youngest. Not with anger, but with a quiet ache that didn't ask for resolution. I wondered what version of me they'd been given. What explanations felt easiest to repeat? I accepted that I might never get to correct them. That was the price. Boundaries don't come free. They cost access. They cost illusion. Sometimes they cost relationships you never imagined losing, but lost anyway, long before you stepped back. I let myself feel that grief without trying to justify it. Without turning it into evidence or strategy. Some losses aren't meant to be leveraged. They're meant to be acknowledged. What surprised me was that the grief didn't undo the peace. It lived beside it. Quiet. Manageable. Honest. I hadn't chosen this outcome because it was painless. I chose it because it was true. Truth doesn't promise comfort. It promises clarity. And clarity, even when it hurts, keeps you from reopening doors that were locked against you with intention. I could hold both things at once, the loss and the freedom, without collapsing under either. That balance told me I had crossed into something real. Not victory. Maturity. By the time spring arrived, my life had settled into a shape that no longer required explanation. There were no updates to track. No outcomes to anticipate. Whatever was still unfolding for Marcellus and Kendra was happening without my involvement, exactly as it should. I didn't ask about it. I didn't need to. I focused instead on what belonged to me. I moved into a smaller place on my own terms. Chose it carefully. Light where I wanted it. Quiet when I needed it. Nothing about it was temporary. That mattered. I reorganized my finances, not out of fear, but out of intention. Every account had a purpose. Every document had a place. There was comfort in knowing that nothing in my life was accessible without my consent. People noticed the change, even if they couldn't name it. I stood differently. Spoke less, but with certainty. I no longer filled silence to make others comfortable. The urge to check in, to manage emotions that weren't mine, was gone. What replaced it wasn't hardness. It was clarity. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't hoping for understanding. I wasn't holding space for a future conversation that would fix the past. That future didn't exist. And that realization didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like ownership. For the first time in years, every decision in my life moved in one direction, forward, without detour. No negotiations. No justifications. No quiet sacrifices made to preserve someone else's comfort. Just a life that belonged fully to me. And that, more than any outcome or consequence, felt like the final shift of power. I drove past the house once, months later. Not to check on it. Not to feel anything specific. I was already in the neighborhood, and the turn came up before I thought about whether I wanted to take it. The porch looked the same. Fresh paint. Different curtains. The wreath was gone. Nothing about it reached for me. I didn't slow down. That was how I knew the story was finished. There was no final conversation. No apology that arrived too late. No moment where everything was named and neatly resolved. What ended things wasn't a confrontation. It was consent withdrawn. I had spent years believing family meant endurance. That love meant staying reachable no matter the cost. That silence was something to be fixed. I know better now. Silence can be a boundary. Distance can be integrity. And walking away, when done without spite or spectacle, can be the strongest statement a person makes. Marcellus and Kendra would go on telling whatever version of the story they needed. Institutions would continue their work. Life would keep rearranging itself around choices already made. None of that required me. What mattered was simpler. I no longer stood outside locked doors hoping to be let back in. I no longer explained myself to people who had already decided. I no longer protected others from the consequences of their own decisions. I went home that evening, closed my own door, and turned the lock. Not in fear. In peace. And for the first time since that Christmas night, the quiet on the other side felt like freedom. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.